The morning Mabel Thatcher stepped off the westbound stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas. Her dress was the color of storm clouds, and her spine was straighter than any fence post on the frontier. And every man who watched her descend from that rattling coach into the summer dust of 1878 felt certain she would be gone within a week. She had come from Springfield, Illinois, with 2 trunks, a leather satchel that held her mother's Bible and her father's veterinary journals, and a letter of employment from one Josiah Whitmore, owner of the Whitmore Ranch, which sprawled across 4,000 acres of Kansas grassland and employed 17 cowboys, 2 cooks, and a blacksmith who had a reputation for being difficult before noon. The letter had been specific. Whitmore needed someone with knowledge of animals, someone who could keep the ranch's medical records, maintain the books, and serve as a secondary hand in the treatment of horses and cattle. Mabel had answered the advertisement in the Springfield Gazette on a Tuesday morning and received her offer the following Thursday. She had packed her things before the ink on her acceptance letter was dry. What the letter had not mentioned was that Josiah Whitmore was 71 years old, nearly deaf in his left ear, and prone to forgetting which animals he had already treated for which ailments. It also had not mentioned his foreman. Elias Norris was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, and possessed of a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same limestone that jutted out of the Kansas hillsides. He had dark eyes the color of good coffee and a permanent squint from years of reading the horizon. He had worked the Whitmore Ranch for 6 years, longer than any other hand, and he ran things with a quiet authority that the other cowboys respected even when they grumbled about it. He was not cruel. He was not unreasonable. He was simply a man who had decided that the frontier required a certain hardness, a certain practical view of the world, and that sentiment was a luxury that the Kansas plains had no patience for. He was leaning against the post of the water trough when the stagecoach pulled in, and he watched Mabel Thatcher climb down into the dust with the expression of a man who has just been handed a problem he did not ask for. Josiah Whitmore, who had ridden into town in his buckboard that morning with all the optimism of a man who has not yet had to explain his decisions, stepped forward and shook Mabel's hand with great enthusiasm. He was a lean old man with a white beard and a permanent hat-shaped tan line across his forehead, and he looked genuinely pleased with himself. "Miss Thatcher, welcome to Caldwell. I trust the journey was not too punishing." "It was exactly as long as it needed to be," Mabel said, and her voice was clear and steady and carried across the street in a way that made 3 cowboys turn their heads. "I'm ready to begin as soon as you like." Josiah beamed. He turned to Elias, who had pushed off from the water trough and was walking toward them with his thumbs hooked in his belt, and that squint fixed on Mabel like she was a weather system he needed to assess. "Miss Thatcher, this here is Elias Norris, my foreman. He'll show you around the ranch once we get you settled." Elias touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Thatcher, Mr. Norris." There was a beat of silence in which they simply looked at each other, and in that silence a great deal was communicated. Mabel saw a man who had already made up his mind about her. Elias saw a woman who knew exactly what he was thinking and had no intention of accommodating it. He picked up one of her trunks without asking. It was the polite thing to do, and Elias Norris was a man who did the polite thing even when he disapproved of the circumstances. Mabel watched him lift it into the buckboard and said nothing, though she made note of the ease with which he handled something that had taken the stagecoach driver and his assistant both hands. The ride out to the Whitmore Ranch was 4 miles of dirt road through grassland that rolled golden and endless in every direction, and Mabel sat in the back of the buckboard between her 2 trunks and watched the horizon swallow the town behind her. The sky here was different from Illinois. It was bigger somehow, more insistent, as though it wanted you to understand that it could go on forever whether you were looking at it or not. She found it honest. She found most things about the frontier honest in that particular way, which was to say that nothing here was pretending to be anything it was not. Josiah talked for most of the ride, telling her about the ranch, about the herd, about a prize bull named General who had developed a limp that the local veterinarian had diagnosed incorrectly twice running. This was, in fact, the primary reason Josiah had hired her. Her father, Dr. Thomas Thatcher, had been one of Springfield's most respected veterinarians, and Mabel had worked alongside him from the time she was 12 years old until his death 2 years prior, when she had been 23. She knew large animal medicine with an intimacy that most formally trained veterinarians lacked because she had learned it from the inside out, from the smell and sound and feel of it rather than from books alone. The books she had too, every journal her father had ever owned, but it was the practical knowledge that lived in her hands and her instincts that had earned her this position. Elias said nothing on the ride out. He drove the buckboard and kept his eyes on the road. Mabel noticed that he was not ignoring her in the way of a man who is indifferent. He was ignoring her in the way of a man who is very aware of something and has chosen to set it aside. The ranch house came into view as they crested a low rise, and it was larger than Mabel had expected. A wide porch wrapped around two sides of the main structure, which was solid and weathered and looked like it had been built with the intention of outlasting everyone who would ever live in it. Behind the house stood a large barn, 2 corrals, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, and a cluster of outbuildings that included what Josiah proudly called the medical shed, a room roughly the size of a generous closet filled with supplies that Mabel assessed with a practiced eye and found adequate, if imperfectly organized. Her room was on the second floor of the main house, small and clean and facing east, so that the morning sun came through the window like a benediction. She unpacked her things that evening while the ranch settled into its supper routine below, and when she came down to eat, 12 pairs of eyes turned to look at her with varying degrees of curiosity, skepticism, and in the case of a young cowboy named Pete Dawson, who was barely 20 and had freckles across his nose like a scatter of rust, undisguised admiration. Elias sat at the far end of the table and said grace with the brevity of a man who believes in God, but has no patience for excessive conversation about it. And then supper was served, and the conversation was the ordinary conversation of working men at the end of a long day. Mabel listened more than she spoke. She learned 3 names, 2 ongoing disputes about fence lines, and the fact that a horse named Rosie had been favoring her left foreleg for a week, and nobody had yet figured out why. "I'd like to look at Rosie after supper if that's agreeable," Mabel said during a pause in the conversation. Josiah nodded enthusiastically. Most of the cowboys exchanged glances. Elias looked at her from the far end of the table without any particular expression. "It's near dark," he said. "I know what near dark looks like," Mabel replied pleasantly. "I brought a lantern." There was a silence that the cowboys recognized as the particular kind of silence that precedes either a fight or a very interesting development. Then Pete Dawson said he would get her lantern from her trunk if she needed it, and the conversation moved on. She examined Rosie after supper by lantern light in the barn, while Elias stood nearby with his arms crossed and said nothing. The mare was a pretty chestnut with an anxious eye, and she shifted when Mabel approached, but Mabel moved slowly and spoke softly, and spent 2 full minutes simply letting the horse smell her hand before she touched anything. Then she ran her fingers along the mare's left foreleg with the careful attention of someone reading a language written in flesh and heat and tension, and within 4 minutes she had found it. A stone bruise on the sole of the hoof that had gone unnoticed because it left no visible mark. "She needs her shoe pulled and the hoof packed with a poultice," Mabel said. "She'll be right in 3 days if you keep her off hard ground." Elias looked at the hoof. He looked at Mabel. "Jake checked that foot twice," he said. Jake was the ranch's most experienced hand with horses. "Jake was looking at the hoof wall," Mabel said. "The injury is on the sole." She was not unkind about it, but she was precise. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll have Pete pull the shoe in the morning. I can show him the poultice mixture. I have a good recipe." Another pause. "All right," he said, and there was something in his tone that was not quite concession but was moving in that direction. She woke the next morning at 4:30 because she always had, because her father had believed that the first hour of morning was the most honest hour and that animals knew it too. She dressed and went out to the barn in the thin gray light, and she found Elias already there, checking on a calf that had been born 2 days prior and was not taking to feeding with the enthusiasm Elias thought it should. He looked up when she came in, and for a moment they were just two people in a barn in the early dark, and neither of them said anything. She looked at the calf. "When did she last nurse?" "Last night before supper," he said. Mabel crouched beside the calf and examined her. "Is the mother letting her approach without too much trouble?" "Mostly." "The calf's tongue placement is off," Mabel said. "It's a small structural thing, nothing serious, but it means she's working twice as hard for half the milk. There's a trick to it." She showed him, and the calf nursed properly for the first time, and Elias Norris stood there watching with an expression that was not quite as closed as it had been the evening before. "You really do know animals," he said. It was not an apology. It was not a compliment exactly. It was a man revising his position, which Mabel suspected was not something he did often or easily. "My father was a veterinarian for 30 years, she said. "I spent those 30 years learning everything he knew, and I spent 2 years after that learning the things I'd missed." She stood and dusted her hands on her apron. "I know the frontier is not what most people back east think it is. I did not come here because I misunderstood it. I came because it suited me." She left him with that and went to start on the morning's work. The days fell into a rhythm after that, a hard one, the kind of rhythm that the frontier imposes on anyone who is willing to submit to it. Mabel rose before the sun. She made her rounds of the animals before breakfast, assessing, treating, noting. She kept meticulous records in a ledger that Josiah admired, and the cowboys thought was unnecessary until the day she was able to tell, from 3 months of entries, exactly which batch of feed had caused a wave of digestive trouble in the cattle and prevented what might have been a serious loss. She worked alongside the hands without apology and without pretense, doing what needed doing with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. She was not immune to the difficulty of it. The Kansas summer was brutal in a way that Illinois summers never had been, the heat sitting flat and heavy on the land without relief from dawn to dusk. The work was physical in ways that challenged muscles she had used her whole life and found new ones she hadn't known existed. She came in at the end of some days so tired that she fell asleep with her boots on and her supper untouched on the nightstand. But she did not complain about any of it, and she did not slow down, and she did not ask for concessions. What she did ask for was competence from the people around her, and she was not shy about it when it was missing. There was a hand named Cole Briggs, 35 years old, with the particular brand of confidence that comes from having been the most experienced person in most rooms he had occupied. He had been on the Whitmore Ranch for 3 years and had appointed himself the authority on everything related to livestock medicine, in the absence of anyone more qualified. When Mabel arrived with her father's journals and her 15 years of practical experience, Cole Briggs experienced this as an affront. He challenged her publicly in her second week, in front of 6 other hands, over the treatment of a heifer with a respiratory infection. He had been administering a remedy that Mabel's father's journals clearly indicated was outdated and mildly counterproductive, and when Mabel said so with her characteristic directness, Cole told her that book learning was all well and good, but that real ranching was learned in the saddle, not in a library. "I agree with you," Mabel said calmly, which surprised him. "That's why I didn't learn it in a library. I learned it in a barn, the same way you did, except that my teacher had 30 years of experience and the intellectual curiosity to keep learning after he'd already become expert. Now, would you like to discuss the correct treatment for the heifer, or would you like to keep discussing my qualifications?" She treated the heifer. The heifer recovered. Cole Briggs did not forgive her for it immediately, but he stopped publicly challenging her treatments, which was what mattered. Elias had witnessed that exchange from across the corral and had said nothing. He did not come to her defense, and Mabel had not expected him to. But that evening at supper, he made a point of asking her what she thought about the condition of the South pasture cattle, and the question was asked in a way that made clear to every man at the table that her opinion on the matter was being solicited as a professional one, and that carried its own kind of weight. She did not thank him for it. She understood it for what it was, not sentiment, but a practical man making a practical acknowledgement of a practical reality. She answered the question with the thoroughness it deserved, and Josiah listened with the satisfaction of a man who has made a good decision, and the meal continued. It was the beginning of a language between them. They were not friends yet, not quite, but they had found a working vocabulary, a way of speaking about the ranch and the animals and the daily necessities that was efficient and unadorned and suited them both. They rode the fence lines together twice a week, because Josiah had decided that Mabel should know the full extent of the property, and these rides were the longest stretches of time they spent together, 2 hours out and 2 hours back through the rolling grassland. She learned that Elias had come from Missouri, that he had been ranching since he was 14, that he had worked 5 different outfits before landing at the Whitmore Ranch. She learned that he read, which surprised her, not newspapers but actual books, and that he kept 3 of them in a worn saddlebag and had strong opinions about their contents. She learned that he was fair to the men under him with a consistency that she came to deeply respect, that he never played favorites and never asked anyone to do something he wasn't willing to do himself, and that the hands regarded him with the particular loyalty that only genuine fairness can generate. She also learned, slowly, that the hardness she had read in him at the beginning was not the whole of him. It was real, and it was deep, and it came from real experience and not from posturing, but it existed alongside something else, something that showed itself in small moments. The way he always checked on the newest animals in the barn before he turned in, not because it was anyone's assigned task, but simply because he wanted to know they were settled. The way he listened when old Josiah talked about his late wife, with the complete and patient attention of someone who understands that some stories need to be told more than once. The way he moved around the horses, not with dominance but with a kind of ease, as though he and the animals had a mutual arrangement that both parties were satisfied with. She mentioned the books one morning on a fence-line ride, somewhere between the north water tank and the old cottonwood that marked the property's corner. "You're reading Dickens," she said. She had seen the spine in his saddlebag. He glanced at her. "You have a problem with Dickens." "Not at all. I was going to say I've read most of him." "My father had a complete set." She paused. "He thought Bleak House was the masterpiece. I've always thought it was Great Expectations." Elias was quiet for a moment. The horses moved through the long grass with their steady, unhurried walk, and the morning sky was enormous above them, white at the edges and blue in the middle, the kind of sky that feels like a second chance. "I've been thinking about that question for 2 years," he said finally, and his voice had something different in it, something less guarded. "Every time I finish one I think that one's the best, and then I start another one." "That's rather the point of him, I think," Mabel said. Elias looked at her then, really looked at her, not with the assessing squint he had fixed on her that first day in Caldwell, but with something more open, and Mabel felt it the way you feel the change in temperature when you step out of shade into sun, a full and certain awareness of it on every surface. She looked away first, not because she was flustered, but because there was a fence post 20 yards ahead that appeared to be leaning at an angle that would need to be addressed, and she had a job to do. She pointed it out. Elias made a note. They rode on. The summer deepened and then burned toward its end, and the work never slackened. August brought a stretch of heat so severe that 3 cattle died of it despite Mabel's efforts, and she took those losses with the practical sorrow of someone who has learned that you can do everything right and still lose, which is one of the frontier's least gentle lessons. September brought the beginning of the cattle drive preparations, which meant weeks of intensified work across every corner of the ranch, and Mabel was in the middle of all of it. It was during the preparation for the drive that she had her first real crisis. General, Josiah's prize bull, the one whose limp had been the original motivation for hiring her, had been doing well under her treatment regime since her arrival. She had correctly diagnosed him with a hoof problem that the previous veterinarian had misidentified, had treated it, and had seen him return to his full proud health over the course of 6 weeks. Josiah had been so delighted that he had given Mabel an impromptu raise that she had not asked for and accepted without fuss. But in the second week of September, General went off his feed and began to show signs of something more serious. Mabel sat up with him 3 nights running, monitoring, adjusting, consulting her journals and her own accumulated knowledge. On the 3rd night, Elias found her in the barn at 2 in the morning, sitting on an overturned bucket with a lantern at her feet and her father's heaviest journal open across her knees. He stood in the barn doorway for a moment, and then he came in without speaking, found another bucket, and sat down a few feet away from her. He did not ask what she was doing or how she was doing. He simply sat, which was, she was coming to understand, one of the things he did best. "I think it's a blockage," she said finally. "I think it's in the early stages, which means we have a window. But I need to treat him tonight, and I need a second pair of hands, and I need them to do exactly what I say without questioning me every 3rd minute." "I'll do it," he said. She looked at him. "It's going to be a long night." "I've had long nights before," he said simply. It was, in fact, the longest night she had spent since coming to the ranch. She worked on General for 4 hours with Elias beside her, calm and steady and completely reliable, doing whatever she asked the moment she asked it. He was strong where she needed strength and gentle where she needed gentleness, and he anticipated her needs with a perceptiveness that she would not have expected from him in those early weeks, but that felt, by now, like something she should have predicted. He was a man who paid attention to things. Of course he paid attention to her. At 6 in the morning, General turned a corner. He was not out of danger yet, but he was moving in the right direction, and Mabel sat back on her heels with relief washing through her like water and found Elias crouching beside her, his elbows on his knees, watching the bull with that steady way of his. "You saved him," Elias said. "We saved him," Mabel said. He looked at her then, and they were close, the proximity of shared effort, and the lantern was making everything warm and soft, and his expression was one she had not seen from him before, something without armor in it. "I told Josiah before you got here," he said, "that the frontier wasn't a place for a gentle woman." He paused. "I was wrong." It was not an easy thing for him to say. She could hear that in the way he said it, measured and slow, the words costing something. "I know you did," she said. He blinked. "Josiah told you." "Josiah tells me everything," she said. "He is a man constitutionally incapable of keeping a secret. He told me the 2nd week. He thought it was funny by then." She studied Elias' face. "I didn't mind it. I've had people underestimate me my whole life. It's considerably less interesting as an obstacle than people seem to think." "What do you do with it?" he asked. He seemed genuinely curious. "I outlast them," she said simply. He was quiet for a moment, and then something moved through his face that was very close to a smile, not a full one. A real Elias Norris smile was a rare and particular thing, but close enough that she could see the shape of it. "I believe that," he said. They walked back to the house together in the early morning, their boots dark with dew, and it occurred to Mabel that this was the most honest conversation she had ever had with a man who was not her father, and that it had taken place over a sick bull in a lantern-lit barn at 6 in the morning, which seemed to her exactly the kind of thing that could only happen on the frontier, and that she would not have changed for anything. General recovered fully. Josiah wept a little when he came to see him standing steady in his pen a week later, and then denied having done so, and Mabel and Elias both pretended not to have noticed. The drive itself was in October, and Mabel's role during it had been a matter of ongoing discussion. The cattle drive to Wichita was 3 weeks of hard travel, and the conventional wisdom, represented primarily by Cole Briggs and 2 other senior hands, was that it was no place for a woman, that she would slow things down, that she was needed at the ranch to look after the remaining animals, which was also true. Mabel herself had not pushed to go on the drive. She had weighed the arguments honestly and concluded that Cole Briggs was right about the remaining animals, wrong about her capability, but right about the priority. She stayed at the ranch with Pete Dawson and old Luther, the blacksmith, and 3 younger hands who were still in training. Elias left with the main drive on a cold October morning with a flat gray sky overhead. He had come to find her the evening before, which she had not expected. She was in the medical shed, inventorying supplies, when she heard his boots on the wooden floor. "We'll be back by the first week of November if things go right," he said. "I know," she said. She was counting a row of glass bottles and did not turn around immediately. If anything major comes up with the herd, Luther knows to send word to the nearest telegraph. "I know that too," she said. She turned around. He was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, which she had never seen before. Elias Norris always had his hat on his head. "I wanted to say," he started, and then paused in the way of a man who has prepared something and found it inadequate upon arrival. "You've been good for this ranch, better than good." "Thank you," she said, and meant it because it was the plainest possible thing and the highest compliment he knew how to pay. He put his hat back on. "I'll see you in November." "See that you do," she said. He left, and the ranch settled into its quieter rhythm, and Mabel worked. She was good at working and better at it when there was a particular shape of absence to work against, though she would not have characterized it to herself in those terms, not then. She told herself she was simply doing her job. She was very good at telling herself things that were partially true. November came in gray and cold, and the cattle drive returned on a Wednesday morning, and Mabel was in the South Corral when she heard the distant sound of cattle and horses and men coming up the long road from Wichita. She stayed where she was because there was a calf she was attending to, and because she was not the kind of woman who ran toward things. She let things arrive. Elias arrived. He was dusty and lean from 3 weeks in the saddle, and when he came around the side of the barn and saw her there in the South Corral with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her hair coming loose from its pins, he stopped and looked at her with an expression that had no guarding in it at all. Just a man who has been away for 3 weeks and is now looking at something he wanted to come back to. "The drive go well?" she asked. "Better than expected," he said. "Good price. Josiah's pleased." "General's fully recovered," she said. "He's been magnificent. I think he knows how close it was." "Animals always know," Elias said. He was still standing there, not quite coming toward her and not quite leaving, and Mabel finished what she was doing with the calf and stood up straight and looked at him across the 10 feet of corral fence between them. "I'm glad you're back," she said. It was a simple thing, spoken plainly, the way she said everything. But it opened something, some door between them that had been standing ajar for months, and Elias Norris crossed the 10 feet of corral fence. Not literally. The fence was still there, but in every way that mattered, and whatever careful distance he had maintained between them collapsed quietly and without ceremony. "I thought about the ranch the whole way down to Wichita," he said. He paused, and on the way back, she waited. "I thought about the morning with General," he said. "I thought about the fence line rides. I thought about you telling me Great Expectations was the masterpiece and me not agreeing with you." Another pause. "I still don't agree with you, by the way." "You're wrong," she said. "Probably," he said, and this time the smile came fully, unhidden, and it transformed his whole face into something warmer and more honest than she had seen from him before, and it was, she thought, one of the finest things she had ever seen. He came around the fence and opened the gate and stepped into the corral, and they stood there in the November cold with the sounds of the returned cattle drive drifting from the other side of the barn, and he looked at her with that full, open look. "Mabel," he said. He had never called her by her first name before. He had always been careful with the Miss Thatcher. "Yes," she said, which was an answer to more than one question. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of her dark hair back from her face with a gentleness that seemed entirely at odds with his large, work-worn hands, and entirely consistent with the man she had come to know over 4 months of early mornings and long rides and honest work. And then he stopped, the way a careful man stops, giving her every chance to step back. She did not step back. He kissed her there in the South Corral on a cold November morning in 1878, a careful, serious, certain kiss, the kind that is a declaration more than a question, and the calf watched them with the unimpressed philosophical gaze of the newly born, and the sky overhead was the pale silver of a Kansas winter coming in. What followed the kiss was not what either of them would have called a simple courtship, because neither of them were simple people, and the ranch was not the kind of place that allowed for simplicity in any case. But it was genuine, which both of them valued more. They ate their meals at the same end of the table gradually, without discussion, until one morning Mabel realized they had been sitting next to each other at breakfast for 3 weeks straight and could not have said when that had started. They talked. They talked in the barn and on the fence line rides and in the evenings on the porch of the main house while Josiah dozed in his rocker with the newspaper across his chest. And Mabel discovered that Elias Norris was a man of considerable depth, whose particular manner of expression was brevity and silence, but who, when sufficiently trusted, had things to say that were worth waiting for. He told her about his father, who had been a hard man in a way that Elias had spent his adult life examining from every angle, trying to separate what had been necessary from what had been merely cruel. He told her about a winter in his early 20s on a ranch in northern Missouri when 3 men had died from a collapse of a structure, and how that had changed the way he thought about safety and precaution, which was where his particular brand of careful authority had come from. He told her about a woman in Missouri that he had thought to marry once, briefly, and who had gone back east after 3 months because the life was not what she had expected. She thought she was prepared for it, he said. She'd grown up on a farm, she knew hard work, but there's knowing and then there's the frontier kind of knowing, and they're not the same thing. Is that why you said what you said to Josiah about a gentle woman? Mabel asked. Partly, he said. He was quiet for a moment. And partly because I think I've been wrong about what gentle means. I thought gentle meant soft, fragile, not suited for this. He looked at her. But you're the gentlest person on this ranch with the animals, and you're also the toughest. I had those 2 things wrong. I thought they were opposites. They're not, she said. No, he agreed. They're not. She told him about her father, about those 30 years of learning at his side, about what it had been like to lose him, which was the central grief of her life and the thing that had propelled her westward. She told him about Springfield and what it had felt like to have a city close around her in the years after her father's death, the respectable and narrow life that was available to her there, the marriage proposals that had come from men who saw a competent woman and thought that meant a competent wife in the domestic sense, who had not understood that she was a professional with a vocation, and that her vocation was not something she was willing to set aside. I've had people tell me my whole life what my life should look like, she said, what I was capable of, what was appropriate, what was gentle enough or strong enough or practical enough for a woman of my situation. I got very tired of it. I imagine you did, he said. The frontier doesn't care about any of that, she said. It only cares if you can do the work. That's true, he said. It's honestly true. December came, and with it the particular cold of Kansas winter that is different from any other cold, wide and relentless and ancient, the kind of cold that makes you understand why shelter is the first thing humans have always sought. The ranch contracted in winter, the pace slower but no less demanding, the cold creating its own category of crisis, frozen water tanks and animals that needed watching for winter ailments and structures that needed reinforcing against the wind. Mabel was in her element. She had worried in October that she might find the winter harder than the summer, but she found instead that she was better suited to it. She had always operated well in conditions that required steadiness over speed, and winter on the frontier was exactly that. It was in December that Cole Briggs, who had been cold to her since their early confrontation and had never fully warmed, finally crossed a line that needed addressing. He had been drinking one evening in the bunkhouse, which was not unusual, and in his drinking had said things about Mabel that were the kind of things that, once said, cannot be unsaid, that questioned her character in the way that men on the frontier sometimes questioned the character of a woman who lived among men and did not behave the way they expected women to behave. Elias heard it from Jake, who told him the following morning, and Elias handled it before noon. Nobody heard the conversation, which took place in the East Corral with no witnesses, but Cole Briggs came back from that conversation with the look of a man who has been given a very clear choice about his future employment and has decided to make the correct one. He apologized to Mabel that afternoon, briefly and without much grace, but without ambiguity, and then he returned to his work, and after that he was neutral toward her in a way that was adequate if not warm. Mabel thanked Elias that evening on the porch. He looked uncomfortable about being thanked. "I should have done it sooner," he said. "You did it when it needed doing," she said. "That's enough." He looked at her steadily, and she looked back, and the cold was coming off the prairie in waves that she could feel even through her heavy wool coat, and she was warm in a way that had nothing to do with the coat. Christmas at the Whitmore Ranch was a modest affair. Josiah's wife had always orchestrated the celebrations, and he had not quite found his way without her. But Mabel organized a dinner with an enthusiasm that delighted the old man and surprised the hands. And Pete Dawson, who had a surprisingly fine singing voice, led them through 3 carols after supper while Josiah sat by the fire and looked content in the particular way of old men who did not expect to be made content anymore. Elias gave Mabel a gift on Christmas morning. It was a book, not Dickens, something she hadn't read, a collection of natural history essays by a writer she admired but had not been able to find in Springfield. She looked at him when she unwrapped it. "Where did you find this?" she asked. "I wrote to a bookseller in Kansas City in October," he said. "Before the drive," he paused. "It seemed like something you'd want." She held the book and looked at him and understood that he had been thinking about what she would want before November, before the South Corral, and that the cattle drive had not been 3 weeks of him missing the ranch incidentally. It had been 3 weeks of a man recognizing something he had not known how to name until he was far enough away to see it clearly. "Thank you, Elias," she said. He nodded, and his jaw was tight in the way it got when he was feeling something he hadn't found words for yet, and she tucked the book under her arm and reached up and touched his cheek briefly with her gloved hand and then went inside to help with Christmas breakfast. January was hard. The hardest month the ranch had seen in years, according to Jake, who had been there the longest. A sustained cold snap drove temperatures below anything Mabel had experienced, and the demands on every person on the ranch were punishing. Animals needed round-the-clock checks. The water tanks had to be broken open twice daily to prevent complete freezing. A section of the barn roof gave way under snow accumulation and needed emergency repair, and Mabel was on the repair crew alongside everyone else, hauling timber in temperatures that turned her breath to fog immediately and made her fingers go wooden inside her gloves. 3 hands quit in January. 2 of them were newer men who had underestimated winter, and the third was a man in his 40s named Vernon who had a bad knee that made the cold unworkable. He left without drama, and Mabel saw him off with the same respect she gave every working person on the ranch. She wrote him a letter of reference that evening, unprompted, that was specific and honest, and that he folded carefully into his inside pocket, and thanked her for with something in his eyes that was close to emotion. The remaining 14 hands watched Mabel that January the way the hands always watch the newest person through the ranch's hardest season, looking for the crack, the point at which someone proves they are not equal to the thing. She gave them no crack. She got up before any of them and she went to bed after most of them, and she did it without complaint and without theater, just steadily, the way she did everything. By February, Something had shifted in the social architecture of the ranch in a way that was not dramatic or announced, but was completely evident to anyone paying attention. Mabel Thatcher was not the newcomer anymore. She was not the woman who needed to prove herself anymore. She was simply part of the ranch, bone and sinew of it, as necessary and reliable as any component of the whole. Cole Briggs, who had been the most resistant, was the one who marked the shift most clearly when, in mid-February, he came to her with a question about a heifer's condition rather than going to Elias first, which was what he would previously have done. He came to her with the specific directness of a man going to the person who knows the answer, and she gave him the answer, and that was that. Elias noticed. He noticed everything. He mentioned it to her that evening briefly, the way he mentioned things that mattered to him. "Cole asked you about the heifer," he said. "He did," she said. "Good," said Elias, and that was the complete conversation, but it contained within it everything that needed saying. February was also the month that Elias kissed her for the second time, which was different from the first in the way that all second kisses are different from first ones. The first is a declaration, the second is a confirmation, and the confirmation is in some ways more significant because it means the decision has been made with full knowledge of the first one. They were in the medical shed, Mabel reorganizing her supply stock after the demands of January. Elias ostensibly checking on a piece of equipment that lived near the back of the shed, and that had not needed checking in any urgent way. The shed was small and warm from a cast-iron stove in the corner, and the winter light came through one small window and made everything amber and quiet. He said her name, and she turned, and he crossed the 2 steps between them and kissed her with a completeness that said, "I have thought about this for a long time, and I am certain, and I intend for this to be the beginning of a great deal more." And she kissed him back with equal certainty and thought, with the part of her mind that was always clear no matter what the rest of her was doing, that the frontier had given her things she had not known to ask for, and that this was the most unexpected and the best of them. When they broke apart, his hands were still on her face, and he was looking at her with those dark eyes that had squinted at her from a water trough in Caldwell the previous summer, and they were completely unguarded now, open all the way through. "I'd like to speak to Josiah," he said. She understood what he meant. "Yes," she said. He spoke to Josiah that evening. Josiah, who had seen this development coming since approximately October, and had been restraining himself from direct commentary, with the heroic effort of a man who has strong opinions and a deep respect for other people's processes, received the news with undisguised delight and pumped Elias' hand so vigorously that Elias later reported that his knuckles had ached. They were engaged by the end of February 1879, in the 9th month of Mabel's arrival at the Whitmore Ranch, and the hands were informed at supper by Josiah, who could not wait, and there was genuine congratulation from most of them, warmer than might have been expected, because by then Mabel was one of theirs and they were protective of their own. Pete Dawson, who had been admiring her from a respectful distance since her arrival, was sincere and gracious about it in the way of a genuinely good-natured young man, and shook Elias' hand and told Mabel she was the finest woman he'd ever had the privilege of working alongside, which made Mabel laugh and Elias reach over and squeeze her hand once under the table. The spring of 1879 came in like a relief, the slow warmth returning to the land, the grass coming back green and new, the animals perking up with the ancient animal knowledge that the hard time was ending. Mabel had been on the Whitmore Ranch for a full cycle of seasons now, had seen it in every light and every weather, and she loved it with the deep practical love of someone who knows a place not as a visitor but as a resident, who knows where it is difficult and beautiful and demanding and generous. She and Elias married in May of 1879 in Caldwell, in the small church that served the community, with Josiah Whitmore standing up for Elias and a woman named Clara Hardwick, wife of a neighboring rancher and the closest thing Mabel had to a friend in the county, standing up for Mabel. The ceremony was simple and the vows were the traditional ones, but Mabel and Elias had also said private things to each other the night before, sitting on the ranch house porch in the warm May dark, things that were specific to them and to this life they had made here, and those were the ones that counted most. Elias had said, "I want you to know that nothing about what you do here or what you are is something I would ever ask you to diminish. Not for me, not for anyone. The ranch needs you the way it needs water. And I need you the way I need air, which is a thing I never expected to say to anyone." Mabel had said, "I came west because I had nothing to stay for in the east. I want you to know that I have more here than I ever thought to have anywhere. Not just you, though that is considerable, all of it. This land and this work and the life I've built in this place. And you, especially you." They had sat together in the dark after that and listened to the prairie, which has its own music at night, the cricket sound and the grass sound and the distant cry of something hunting, and it had felt like the most complete moment either of them had ever occupied. After the wedding, Mabel Norris, as she was now, moved her things from the second-floor room she had occupied to the larger room that Elias had in the east wing of the house, and they arranged it together on a rainy afternoon in May, moving furniture and arguing pleasantly about the placement of a bookshelf. And when everything was where it needed to be, they stood in the middle of the room looking at the combined evidence of their two lives, his books and her journals, his hunting rifle and her medical kit. And it looked entirely right. The summer of 1879 brought new challenges that the summer of 1878 had not, because the ranch was growing. Josiah, energized by the events of the previous year and by the most profitable cattle drive in a decade, had expanded the herd, taken on 4 new hands, and begun plans to extend the eastern pasture. This meant more animals, more responsibility, more work, and more of every kind of crisis that the frontier generates when you give it more material to work with. Mabel was at the center of all of it and thriving in a way that was visible to everyone around her. She had always been competent, had been competent from the first morning, but now she was operating with the particular confidence of someone who has been fully tested and fully established, who knows her ground in every sense. She had the authority she had earned and the standing she had built, and she was not shy about exercising either. She hired a young woman named Ruth, the 17-year-old daughter of a Caldwell family, to assist in the medical shed and to learn basic animal medicine under her supervision, because Mabel had been taught by her father, and she believed deeply in the transmission of knowledge. Ruth was quick and earnest and terrified of large animals, which Mabel considered a promising starting point because caution was the foundation of good practice. She established, through considerable persistence and Josiah's willing cooperation, a relationship with a veterinarian in Wichita named Dr. Samuel Penn, who came to the Whitmore Ranch twice a year for formal consultations, and with whom Mabel exchanged letters regularly about difficult cases. This was not common practice for ranches of the Whitmore's size, but Mabel made the case for it clearly, and the results over the following years would make it a point of pride for the operation. She also began to be known beyond the ranch. Other operations in the county sent for her when they had animal medicine problems they couldn't solve, and she went, usually riding out alone or with one of the hands as an escort, carrying her father's journals and her own growing stack of case notes. Elias watched this expansion of her practice with an expression that was equal parts pride and something that was not quite worry but was adjacent to it, the awareness that the world now knew what he knew about her and that the world's knowing would take her away from him sometimes. "You're gone 3 days out of 7 some weeks," he said one evening in July. "4 out of 7 last week," she said, "counting the ride to and from. Is that a problem?" He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "It's just that I married you and I like to see you." She laughed, which he always seemed surprised by and always seemed pleased with. "Then come with me sometimes. You've been wanting an excuse to see how the Hendersons are running their south pasture." He came with her twice that summer and 3 times in the fall, and those rides became the fence line rides of the second year. Two people on horseback through the enormous Kansas landscape, talking about everything and nothing, the comfortable wordless stretches between them as natural as breathing. In October of 1879, Mabel told Elias that they were going to have a child. She told him in the kitchen of the ranch house on an evening when the first hard frost had come in, and the lamp on the table was making everything gold and warm. She said it directly, the way she said everything without preamble, watching his face. He went very still in the way he went still when something significant arrived, processing it at whatever depth he processed things. Then he said, "You're certain?" "Completely," she said. He stood up from the table and came around to her and put his hands on her face the same way he had in the medical shed in February, the same complete and certain gesture, and he kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and then pressed his forehead against hers and stayed there for a long moment without speaking. "I don't know how to do this," he said quietly. "I don't know the first thing about being a father." "You know how to take care of things," she said. "You know how to be patient and present and steady. That's the majority of it." "That's a generous definition," he said. "It's an accurate one," she said. Josiah Whitmore, informed the following morning, cried openly and made no effort to deny it. And it was the most emotion Mabel had seen from him, including the general recovery and the Christmas dinner, and she was moved by it in a way she hadn't expected because she understood that Josiah was not just happy for them. He was happy for the continuity of this place he loved, for the evidence that the life he had built here would extend beyond him. The pregnancy changed the rhythm of the ranch in ways that were primarily invisible because Mabel refused to allow it to change very much. She modified what needed modifying and continued the rest. Elias was watchful in a way that was sometimes excessive, and that she told him so about plainly, and he received it plainly and moderated himself mostly. He could not entirely help it. He brought her things before she asked for them and contrived to be wherever she was whenever possible, and when she called him on this he said, with dignity, that he was simply being present, and that it was his right as her husband to be present. And Mabel said he was hovering, and he said he was not hovering, and this was an argument they had 4 times and never resolved to either party's satisfaction. The hands treated her with the same careful reverence that working people have always extended to expectant mothers, with Pete Dawson performing small acts of assistance that were so transparent in their motivation, and so genuinely well-intentioned that Mabel accepted them with the grace they deserved. The baby arrived in June of 1880, a boy, delivered by the Caldwell doctor with Elias in the next room making a studied effort to remain calm that fooled nobody, least of all Mabel, who could hear him through the wall moving in the distinctive pattern of a man who is not sitting still. The birth was difficult in the standard ways that births were difficult, and Mabel came through it with the same steadiness she brought to everything, sweating and exhausted, and when it was over, looking at the baby in her arms with an expression that she would never be able to describe, and that Elias, when he came into the room, read immediately and correctly. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was red and loud and apparently quite put out about the whole business of arrival, and Elias' face did something she had only seen it do a handful of times, that full unguarded thing, open all the way down. "What do we name him?" he asked. They had discussed names cautiously, neither wanting to commit too fully before the birth, some frontier superstition about certainty attracting bad luck, but there had been one name that both of them had mentioned separately at different times, and that had never needed further discussion. "Thomas," Mabel said, her father's name. Elias nodded. He reached out one finger to the baby's fist, and Thomas Norris wrapped his hand around it with the absolute authority of the newly born who do not yet know they are small. "Thomas it is," Elias said. Thomas Norris was a loud, healthy, spectacularly opinionated baby who made his preferences known at every opportunity, and who charmed the entire ranch within the first week of his life. Even Cole Briggs, who was not a man given to sentiment, stood over the cradle one afternoon with the expression of someone confronted with an argument he cannot refute. Josiah Whitmore held Thomas for an hour that first week with the contentment of a man who has received something he wanted more than he knew. Mabel returned to her full work schedule at 6 weeks, which was earlier than Elias thought was prudent and later than she thought was strictly necessary. They negotiated it in the specific way of two people who both have strong opinions and genuine respect for each other, which meant that each of them moved from their initial position toward the middle and arrived at something neither of them had started with, which was the Norris method of marriage generally. Ruth, the girl she had been training in the medical shed, was now 2 years into her education and handling a substantial portion of the daily work capably. Mabel was proud of her with the particular pride of a teacher. Ruth had grown from a frightened child around large animals into a confident and careful practitioner, and when Mabel needed to be in 2 places at once, which was frequently, Ruth was the second place. The ranch in 1880 and into 1881 was a prosperous and living thing, larger than it had been when Mabel arrived, more systematized, better organized, its animals healthier and its records more complete than at any point in its history. Josiah watched it all with satisfaction from his porch, his hearing declining but his contentment increasing, and he told anyone who would listen that hiring Mabel Thatcher was the finest decision he had ever made, which was an opinion widely held and occasionally verified in specific terms by the ranch's accounts. Elias and Mabel had found, by the autumn of 1881, the particular steady warmth of a marriage that has been tested by real circumstance and has proved equal to the test, not the dramatic fever of new love but something deeper and more sustaining, a love built from knowing each other inside the reality of daily life. They argued about the bookshelf placement and about his hovering and about whether Great Expectations was the masterpiece. Mabel still held that it was, and Elias still disagreed, and they had argued about it so many times that the argument had become a form of affection. And they understood each other in the complete way of people who have shared a great deal of difficult and beautiful experience and have chosen to keep sharing it. He brought her coffee in the mornings before she made her rounds, not because she needed it, but because he knew she liked it, and because it was a way of saying something that did not require words. She saved him the interesting pages of the newspapers that came from Kansas City, the items about science and natural history, and sometimes literature, because she knew what he cared about, and caring about what someone cares about is one of the essential acts of love. These were small things, and the frontier was not interested in small things, but that was what Mabel and Elias Norris had learned together. The frontier could not take away the small things if you held them deliberately. In the winter of 1881, Josiah Whitmore, who was 74 years old and had been slowing in the particular way of very old men who are still sharp in the mind but tired in the body, called Elias and Mabel to his study and told them he wanted to discuss the future of the ranch. He was not ill, he was at pains to clarify, but he was realistic, and realism was something all 3 of them valued. He proposed to give them the ranch. Not sell it, give it in his will with the condition that they carry it forward in the spirit in which it had been built, which was to say with fairness to the hands, with care for the animals, and with the kind of practical stubbornness that the Kansas frontier required. Mabel looked at Josiah across the desk of his study and felt something move through her that was very close to what she had felt looking at Thomas in the hospital, a sense of full arrival, of something resolving into its correct shape. "Josiah," she said, "that's an extraordinary thing to offer." "It's the right thing," he said simply. "I don't have children of my own. My wife and I tried, and it was not God's plan, and I've made my peace with it. But I have this place, and I'd like it to go to people who understand it. You 2 understand it better than anyone." Elias said, "We would be honored." They shook hands on it, all 3 of them, and Josiah's eyes were bright, and then he asked Pete to bring him his brandy because he felt the occasion warranted it. Spring of 1882 arrived with exceptional grace, the grass coming in more green and full than anyone could remember, the winter having been mild and the spring rains exactly right, the kind of year the frontier offers occasionally as though to apologize for the harder ones. Mabel stood on the porch of what was increasingly becoming the Norris Ranch in spirit, if not yet in legal name, and looked out over the pastures and the corrals and the busy, ordinary life of the place, with a feeling that took her a moment to identify, because she had not experienced it in quite this form before. It was the feeling of being exactly where you were meant to be. Not by fate or by destiny or by any of the romantic constructions that novels offered, but in the practical, earned, specific sense. She had come to this place and done this work and built this life, and the life fit her the way good working boots fit after they have been broken in. Not soft, not without friction, but right, calibrated to her specific shape. Thomas was 2 years old and had recently learned to walk with the decisive and slightly aggressive confidence of a person who has decided that mobility is a right and intends to exercise it fully. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's serious eyes, and the particular combination of both their temperaments, which meant he was stubborn and observant and periodically delightful. Elias carried him around the ranch with a patience that was new to him, and that he brought to it the same way he brought everything, fully and without half measures. On a May morning of 1882, Mabel told Elias over breakfast that Thomas would have company by winter. He took this information with the composure of a man who had been through it once and knew better than to let composure slip immediately. And then his composure slipped immediately, and he stood up from the table and laughed, which was a sound he made rarely and that Mabel never tired of hearing, open and honest and young. And he picked Thomas up from his chair and held him up in the morning light and said, "Thomas, you're going to have a brother or a sister." And Thomas looked at him with the philosophical patience of a 2-year-old who is more interested in breakfast. "You're not going to hover this time," Mabel said. "I have no idea what you're talking about," Elias said. "I never hovered." She looked at him. "I will make every effort," he said, "not to hover." "Better," she said. He set Thomas down and came around the table and kissed her with the full warmth of a man who has learned to show what he feels and has found the showing easier than he expected, and Mabel pressed her hand against his chest where his heart was beating, warm and steady and certain. In the autumn of 1882, Josiah Whitmore died quietly in his sleep on a Tuesday night in September, in the room he had slept in for 43 years, and was found in the morning by the ranch cook looking entirely peaceful, which the doctor confirmed was consistent with his heart having simply decided its work was done. He was 75 years old and had lived a full life, and left it with his affairs in order and his ranch in good hands, and Mabel wept for him with the sincere grief of someone who has lost a person they genuinely loved. And Elias stood at the funeral in Caldwell, with the posture of a man carrying weight and bearing it. The ranch was theirs officially by December, and the legal transfer brought with it no drama and no complication because Josiah had been meticulous, and the hands all stayed, all 13 of them, because the transition in leadership was not a transition in character or in fairness, and they knew it. Pete Dawson, who was now 24 and had grown from an enthusiastic boy into a genuinely excellent cowhand, was made junior foreman, a decision Elias announced at supper, and that was received with the particular approval of people who have watched someone earn something. The baby arrived in December of 1882, on a cold night when the prairie outside was white and still, and the house was warm from every fireplace lit at once. A girl this time, smaller and quieter than Thomas had been, with Mabel's same directness already visible in the way she looked at the room when she first opened her eyes, as though she was assessing whether it would be adequate. "She's looking at us like she's already making decisions about us," Elias said. "She probably is," Mabel said. "She comes by it honestly." They named her Clara, after Clara Hardwick, who had stood up for Mabel at their wedding, and who had become, in the years since, the close friend that the frontier does not always offer but that Mabel had been lucky enough to find. The Norris Ranch in 1883 was a home in the fullest and most practical sense of that word. Thomas was 3 and into everything, following his father around the corrals with a serious expression, and a pointed stick that he had decided was a tool of some kind, the purpose of which he had not yet shared. Clara was an infant of strong opinions and powerful lungs, who nevertheless slept with the absolute stillness of someone very satisfied with the dark. The hands were good, hard-working people who had found in Elias and Mabel leadership that was fair and competent and honest, the best kind. Ruth, who was 20 now, had become a skilled animal practitioner in her own right, and had begun talking about whether she might someday study formally in Kansas City, and Mabel encouraged her with the same enthusiasm her father had encouraged her. On an evening in the spring of 1883, Elias and Mabel sat together on the porch of the house that was now fully and legally theirs, in the last of the daylight, with the prairie stretching out to the west, and the sky going through its extraordinary colors as the sun went down, and they could hear Thomas inside demanding something of the cook with the conviction of a person who expects to be taken seriously, and Clara was asleep in the house, and the sounds of the ranch evening were all around them. The horses settling for the night, the cattle distant and steady, the voices of the hands finishing the day's work. Mabel thought about the morning she had stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, 5 years and a whole life ago. She thought about the man she had seen leaning against the water trough with his thumbs in his belt and his squint and his prior certainty about what she was and was not capable of. She thought about General's recovery and the South Corral and the medical shed in February and the Christmas book and the wedding in May and Thomas's first breath and Josiah's study and all of it, every season and every crisis and every long fence-line ride and every argument about Dickens. "You never finished telling me about Bleak House," she said. Elias glanced at her from his chair. "What?" "You said last fall you were rereading it. You never told me if you'd come around." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the prairie with that steady way of his, and then something moved through his face that was the smile she had seen the first time in November of 1878 and that she had been watching ever since, every version of it, and still thought was one of the finest things she had ever seen. "I haven't come around," he said. "I still think it's the masterpiece." "You're wrong," she said. "Probably," he said. She laughed, and he reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of her chair and held it without speaking, and the sky went red and orange, and then the deep blue of Kansas evening, and the first stars appeared, and the prairie was still and vast and honest as it had always been, asking nothing except that you be equal to it, and they were. She was. The years that followed were built from the same materials that the first ones had been: hard work and honest dealings, and the specific love of two people who have chosen each other fully, and kept on choosing each other through every ordinary and extraordinary thing that life puts in the path of a marriage. They lost cattle in dry years and recovered in good ones. They expanded the pasture to the south and improved the water system. They hired a young man who turned out to be gifted with horses in a way that made even Jake shake his head with respect, and they lost Pete Dawson to his own ambition when he left in 1886 to start his own outfit, which Elias and Mabel helped him do in every practical way they could, because that was what you did for people who had been good to you. Thomas at 6 was already shadowing his father around the ranch, with a purposeful focus that was both endearing and slightly alarming in its intensity. Clara at 3 was her own small weather system, sometimes calm and sometimes not, always interesting, already spending time in the medical shed watching her mother work with an attention that was recognizable to anyone who had known Mabel as a girl, following her father through barns. In 1887, a particularly wet spring brought a complicated outbreak of illness through a portion of the herd that required 6 weeks of intensive management, and the full deployment of every skill Mabel had accumulated in nearly a decade of frontier practice. She brought in Dr. Penn from Wichita for a consultation, worked alongside him for 4 days, and the combination of his formal training and her specific knowledge of the Norris herd and the particular conditions of the land produced a treatment approach that worked, and that both of them later wrote about in professional correspondence that went to ranchers across the state. Elias watched her during those 6 weeks the way he had watched her with General 9 years earlier, with the same admiring steadiness, but with the deeper knowing of 9 years of marriage behind it, the understanding that this was not something she did in addition to her other qualities, but that it was fundamental to who she was, the vocation running through her the way the best things run through people, all the way down. She came in late one night at the end of the 4th week. The crisis mostly passed, but not entirely, and he had kept her supper warm and was sitting at the kitchen table reading when she came in, and she sat down across from him and ate her supper and told him how the day had gone, the specific details that she knew he wanted because he always wanted the specifics, and he listened with his full attention the way he had always listened. And when she finished, she put her fork down and looked at him in the lamplight. "I love this life," she said. It was not a declaration of gratitude or of contentment exactly. It was something more elemental, the statement of a woman who has built exactly the life she needed to build and knows it. "I know," he said. And then, because he was Elias and he said the things that mattered with the particular care and weight they deserved, "I love you, the way you are in this life, all of it." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and they stayed like that for a while in the warm kitchen in the lamplight, with the prairie dark and vast outside the windows and their children asleep upstairs, and the ranch going on around them in its steady living way. The Norris Ranch had outlasted the winter of 1879 that had driven 3 men away. It had outlasted Josiah Whitmore's death and the grief of that. It had outlasted dry seasons and wet ones, disease in the herd and trouble with neighboring operations, and the 1,000 ordinary difficulties that the frontier generates without ceasing. It had outlasted the early certainty of every man who had looked at Mabel Thatcher stepping off a stagecoach in the summer of 1878 and decided what she was and was not capable of. She had outlasted them all. Not by fighting them or by proving them wrong in dramatic terms, but simply by continuing, season after season, to be exactly who she was and to do the work she knew how to do, and by doing it better in time than anyone else on the ranch. It was Elias who said it, finally, in the summer of 1888, 10 years after she had arrived, on a fence-line ride that was not so different from the ones they had ridden in 1878, except that they knew each other all the way through now, and the horses knew them back, and the grassland was completely familiar and completely beautiful. "You know what Jake said to me last week," he said. "Tell me," she said. "He said that in 12 years on this ranch he's worked for Josiah and he's worked for me, and that this is the first time the ranch has felt like it had all its pieces right." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the horizon the way she had always looked at it, with the forward attention of someone interested in what's out there. "What did you say?" she asked. "I said he was right," Elias said. "And that the piece we'd been missing was the one who showed up on the Caldwell stagecoach in July of 1878 and fixed General and argued with me about Dickens." "You could have just said me," she said. "I did," he said. "I just took my time getting there." She laughed, and the sound went out across the grassland and was swallowed by the enormous Kansas sky, and they rode on together through the long afternoon with the sun moving toward the west and the grass moving in the wind and the whole wide frontier around them, asking for everything they had, and getting it, and returning it. By the close of that summer, Thomas was 8 years old and had demonstrated a gift for working with horses that made Elias quietly proud and Mabel openly delighted. Clara was 5 and had begun helping Mabel in the medical shed in ways that were primarily supervisory on Clara's part, and that Mabel accommodated with the patience of someone who recognizes a familiar spirit. The ranch was prosperous and sound and properly theirs, legal and practical and moral, and the hands that remained were men who had chosen to stay because of the fairness and the competence of the operation and the genuine decency of the people running it. In the fall of 1888, Mabel took on a formal teaching role for a group of ranchers' wives and daughters in the county who had expressed interest in animal medicine. She organized it through the Caldwell Community Hall, and once a month she rode into town and spent an afternoon teaching basic animal health and husbandry to 12 women of varying ages and backgrounds. And it was one of the things she did that gave her the most satisfaction: the transmission of her father's knowledge and her own through the next generation of women who needed it. Elias came with her on those Caldwell days, not always, but often enough that it became a kind of standing date, the two of them riding in together in the morning and stopping at the general store and the bookseller, and occasionally the hotel dining room for a lunch that was not ranch cooking, which was good, but was someone else's cooking, which was a novelty. He had finally conceded, on one of those Caldwell lunches in the fall of 1888, on the question of great expectations. "All right," he said, with the expression of a man making a significant concession. "You may be right about great expectations." Mabel set down her coffee cup and looked at him. "That took 10 years. "I've been thinking about it carefully," he said. "What changed your mind?" "I've been rereading it," he said. "And I think the thing I missed before was that it's not really about ambition or class. It's about someone learning what they actually need versus what they thought they wanted. And I hadn't read it yet with enough of my own life behind me to understand that properly." Mabel looked at him across the lunch table in the Caldwell Hotel dining room and felt the thing she had felt on the porch that spring evening in 1883, the full arrival, the sense of everything in its correct place. Except now it was deeper because there was more behind it, more years and more experience and more of the particular accumulation that is a shared life well lived. "You know," she said, "I have reconsidered Bleak House." He looked at her with sharp attention. "I think it might be more significant than I originally gave it credit for," she said. He narrowed his eyes. "Are you doing this deliberately?" "I'm reconsidering it seriously," she said. "I think it may take me another 10 years to fully decide." He looked at her for a moment and then laughed, fully, the laugh she never tired of, and the other diners in the hotel restaurant glanced over at them and saw a man and a woman at a corner table in an ordinary Kansas town, happy in the specific and visible way of people who have built something real and know it, and who find, still and always, delight in each other. They rode home in the late afternoon through the golden light of a Kansas fall, the grassland on either side of the road amber and moving in the soft wind, the horses easy and unhurried. The ranch came into view on the rise ahead, the house and the barn and the corrals and all of it, and Mabel could see the small figures of Thomas and Clara in the near corral with Pete Dawson's replacement, a young hand named Harris, who was teaching Thomas something about rope work. She and Elias rode in through the gate and dismounted and handed the horses to Harris, and stood for a moment in the early evening of the Norris ranch, with their children's voices carrying across the yard and the smell of supper coming from the house and the whole enormous sky going amber above them. "Good day," Elias said. "Very good day," Mabel agreed. He put his hand at the small of her back in the easy, certain way he had, and they walked together toward the house where their life was, through the frontier evening that had given them everything worth having, and which they had given everything worth giving in return. The years would continue, more seasons and more work and more of the love that had been built from honest material and had proved, like the house itself, equal to everything the frontier could throw at it. Thomas would grow into a rancher of genuine skill, and would one day run the operation with the same quiet authority his father had modeled for him. Clara would grow into the animal medicine that was in her blood and her bones, trained by her mother as her mother had been trained by her grandfather, the knowledge passing forward in the tradition of people who understand that what you know is only truly yours when you have given it away. The Norris Ranch would stand for generations, and the people who built it would be remembered as the kind of people who earned their place by showing up every morning and doing the work without complaint and without pretense. But that was all ahead. Tonight was the supper table and the lamplight and Thomas's rope questions and Clara's detailed opinions about something she had observed in the medical shed that afternoon, and Elias passing Mabel the bread with the particular look that meant he was thinking something and would tell her later, in the quiet after the children were in bed, when the house settled, and the prairie was dark and vast outside, and the two of them had the whole honest world to themselves. She had come west on a stagecoach in July of 1878 with 2 trunks and her father's journals and a spine straighter than any fence post, and she had found the life she was made for, and the man who had been wrong about her and said so, and the land that asked everything and returned it, and the work that was the same as breathing. She had outlasted every doubt and every winter and every man who had decided in advance what she was, and she had loved it, every bit of it. She sat down at her table in her house on her ranch in the last golden light of a Kansas fall evening, and she was home.